Hi, everybody, and welcome to the next lesson. We're going to be talking today about nurturing your children and nurturing them through the process of actually setting some boundaries. We know that parents play a critical role in a child's cognitive, emotional, physical, and social development. This is not new. We know this. This is something that we are aware of when we're parenting children. We're also aware that parenting is conceived in terms of three styles that we often talk about. So, first of all, there's the authoritative parent. This parent exudes warmth and encourages their child to freely express themselves. They impose rules as a mean to meet their children's needs and explain reasons for these rules. The authoritarian parent values obedience and respect for authority. So the authoritarian sort of parent are directive, they're verbally hostile, and they use physical punishment and expect children to accept parental authority unquestioningly. And then the third sort of parents are permissive parents. Permissive parents fail to monitor their children, they often ignore them and their children's activities, and they lack follow through on certain behaviors. So we know that most parents fit into one of these types of parenting. And we often talk about authoritative parenting emerging as the most optimal form of parenting for children because this really nurtures self confidence and self reliance and leads to better socio emotional and academic outcomes and fewer externalizing problems. Authoritarian and permissive parenting has been identified as risk factors for antisocial behavior, low social competence, and poor academic performance. And this is what we refer to as a less optimal form of parenting. Understanding narcissism in terms of the relationship of parenting is important. Grandiose narcissism is actually on the rise in Western cultures. And surprisingly, there's been only a small amount of research as to how narcissistic parents actually parent children. So, the question that we're asking is, are narcissistic parents more likely to engage in non optimal rather than optimal parenting? Because of a narcissist's lack of warmth towards others, we could predict a negative relationship between narcissism and authority parenting. Based on narcissist ego involvement and defensiveness, we could predict a positive relationship between narcissism and authoritarian parenting. And finally, given the narcissism is not caring and often negative towards others, we could actually link non optimal parenting to narcissism. This would mean that narcissism has a negative effect on the parenting style of a parent. By nurturing children, we ensure that they feel loved and supported. Children who are nurtured know that they have families and homes that are loving, safe, and nurturing. This unit explores how to support your children through co-parenting process to ensure that they feel nurtured. In 2021, a colleague of mine, Kamal Jasanga, actually interviewed 13 individuals who identified that one of their parents was a narcissist. And there are a number of things that came from this study. The first being that their home was a scary place. Participants described their mother as controlling and recounted several examples of where their mother's unpredictable rage stopped them from feeling safe and secure. It actually led them to be feeling manipulated, abused, and within a violent situation. One participant, Lucy, had difficulty remembering her childhood, yet vividly remembered the time when her mother delayed seeking medical treatment and instead threatened Lucy by saying that if her arm wasn't broken, she'd break it for her. Another participant, Elizabeth, recollected feeling lost and lonely, neglected and emotionally abandoned, and even frightened of her mother. She said she was always in survival mode and everything was around her mother. Loneliness and neglect also resonated with another participant, Mary, whose experiences left her feeling alone, like she was on an island, like there was something wrong with her. The participants of the study also reflected that the many ways in which they coped with their adversities. In addition to avoiding appearances, one participant, Jessica, coped by playing her mother's therapist and suppressing her own feelings. Mary explained that she had disassociated a lot as a child to cope with the pain of her childhood, and another avoided her mother and did whatever it took to please her. What the participants in the study were describing was their childhood being devoid of any sort of nurturance, security, and safety. Another theme that participants demonstrated was how their relationship with their intimate partners, their friends, and their children were actually affected. The participants accounted their conviction and that their relationships with their parent had detrimental impact on how they negotiated relationships within their lives. Several participants also articulated their feelings of excessive guilt, self-blame, and the difficulty in maintaining healthy boundaries in asserting themselves. Although some participants described having feelings in their adult relationships, it was also the case that some participants actually reported being in loving, supportive, and intimate relationships, with some of the participants having long term successful marriages. One participant, Oliver, suggested his longing for family made him gravitate towards stable mates from other good families, and he maintained these strong relationships and friendships with his male friends. In addition, participants who had children expressed their belief that they had consciously parented their children in ways different to that they had been parented. These participants experiences around their relationship difficulties are consistent with those who report to be adult survivors of childhood trauma. However, look, it's not all doom and gloom. There was an overarching theme of a journey of healing. This journey eventually led the participants to define their parents as a narcissist. By adopting this mental health label, these participants were able to put the jigsaw pieces together and make sense of aspects of their lives that previously didn't make any sense. In doing so, these participants effectively engaged the process of developing an alternative narrative to their lives, one of which viewed them as a survivor. Unlike their old life story, the participants found that this new narrative fit with significant facets of their life. This preferred narrative also enabled them to accelerate themselves and exclude themselves from the blame of their childhood and their relationship difficulties. Labeling their parent as a narcissist let the participants comprehend why their experiences have deviated from the taken for granted or shared understanding of an ideal parent. It gave them an exemption from a sense of personal failure and blame for not having achieved this ideal. And furthermore, it gave them a permission to grieve this last ideal. Look, I want to acknowledge that the only thing more challenging than separating from a divorcing from a narcissistic spouse is managing, co-parenting, and navigating your child through the tricky territory of having a narcissistic parent. Narcissistic parents lack empathy, are entitled, are arrogant and validation seeking. They're grandiose, they're victimized and egocentric, and they can be rageful. Because narcissism can present itself in such varied ways, children in these situations often struggle with tremendous anxiety. Children with narcissistic parents typically display other patterns, such as being distracted, having a sense of shame, and having a sense of self-blame. Dysregulation can manifest itself in internalizing patterns. They can self-harm, and they can have behaviors which are often described as tantrums or outbursts. They can externalize these feelings, and this can manifest itself in substance abuse, sexual risk-taking, and rebellious behaviors. You might also observe the onset of narcissistic behaviors in the child, especially as they move into adolescence and emerging adulthood. Some behaviors that you might see is a sense of self-entitlement, oppositionality, invalidation, gaslighting themselves, and even self-victimization. As your child transitions into the adult world, they may choose relationships or friendship situations related to the narcissistic abuse that they observed and perhaps experienced with the narcissistic parent. So, what do? This is the vexing question that so many parents in this situation stew over. First of all, it's crucial that you don't speak poorly of the narcissistic parent to the child. You will agonize and you will wish that you could just spell it out for your child, but you can't. A child with a narcissistic parent is confused because this isn't the relationship that they're after. Sadly, no matter how poorly children are treated by their parent, they often maintain a fierce alliance with that parent. There's no pushing fast forward on this. Doing so can actually confuse the child, who might still see the narcissistic parent as a good parent. The next thing that you need to ensure is that you don't gaslight your own child. And what do I mean by this? You do not need to paint the narcissistic parent out to be a saint or a wonderful person. You do not want to say that they didn't mean to, or they didn't, or they love you, or follow through and make excuses for them. When you do that, you leave the child confused. But if they bring it up, an uncomfortable scenario with you, tell your child that they can talk to you about it. You don't need to fix it, but you can offer empathy over how it is and reassure them that it's none of their fault. Just think about their parents being a bad person, or getting in a rage, or threatening to call the other parent. It leaves the child feeling that they aren't in a safe place to talk unless what they are raising is related to danger and puts the child in danger. Let the child talk to you. I always recommend what I call the 30,000 foot technique. It's a strategy that I often give to parents. When your child talks to you about the narcissistic parent, offer empathy and support, but don't try and fix it. The 30,000 foot view means that when you want to offer a more pointed feedback, try and talk in terms of all adults. For example, you might say, I hear you. Having to deal with this much anger is exhausting. Using generic language might actually give you the chance to pull back so you aren't taking on the responsibility specifically. By making it all about adults rather than the other parent, you can help provide your child with some context of the situation. Let them know it's not acceptable and validate their feelings. It's also important to keep in mind developmental issues. Obviously, a 4-year-old will have very different experience than that of a 14-year-old child. Narcissistic parents struggle differently at each stage of a child's development. The drudgery of small children can frustrate them, though they're often easier to do simple things with, like a trip to the park. The defiance and backtalk with adolescents can actually trigger narcissistic parents into rages. These parents view their children and everyone else as an accessory to provide their narcissistic supply, rather than seeing them as children who have emotional and other needs that they're responsible for. The way you help your child cope with this situation will shift as your child gets older. It's also important to infuse your household with empathy. This is easier if you're living apart from the narcissistic parent, but make time and space for your emotional conversations to be present with your child's emotions. Work on emotional identification, which you can do with younger children by reading books and discussing how the characters might feel. As your children get older, choose age appropriate movies to watch. And after the movie, don't just turn it off and go apart and go your separate directions. Instead, try and talk about the emotions evoked by the story, situation, or characters. Also, try building emotional questions as an identification to day life. So rather than asking, how did the test go, for example, ask, how did you feel after the test today? Another thing that we can do is teach your children self-regulation and self-soothing techniques. Don't try and fix everything for them, but support them through their struggles. This can be as simple as playing board games and not letting them win all the time and teaching them to be okay with losing. Let them cry it out each time they're the loser of a big game. When they try and blame others for their misfortunes, teach them about taking responsibility. When a child watches a narcissistic parent take blame for other people, it can be an easy trap to fall into. Don't let your child make the same mistake. It's also really important to practice consistency. Narcissistic parents in their household are notoriously inconsistent. They can be the prototypical Disneyland parent, the checked out parent when they're dating somebody else, or they're too stressed from work. They may put you in an unbelievable position of being the buzzkill parent, having to deal with homework, school registrations, and bedtimes. Despite the complaints, children actually welcome routine. They may gripe, but it's reassuring to have at least one parent maintain routine. It will foster a sense of safety and regulation in your child. So, consistency is essential. Sadly, having a narcissistic parent can cast a lifelong echo. This means it's even more critical for a child to have a parent who can see them, support them, and offer them stability. With at least one good, non narcissistic parent, the child can foster resilience in the face of many challenges, the many challenges brought on by a narcissistic parent. Co parenting with a narcissist will always be difficult. Still, you can help your child grow and succeed by providing emotional nourishment, validation, unconditional love, and the proper psychological tools. See you later.